Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and today I'm going to be doing my May wrap up and talking about all the books that I read in the month of May. I read 10 books in the month of May, which I feel pretty happy with. Some of them I liked much more than others, and there were quite a few 3-star reads for me this month, but I did also read some brilliant books. So yes, let's get on to the books without any further ado. So to start off, as always, with the classics first, I'm going to talk about the Victorian books I read this month, one of which was Hard Times. This was a reread for me. I have read this many times before. I read this for my not so hypothetical Victorian literature course video that I did comparing this with North and South and talking about industrialisation and how they are characterised and explored in these two books. I will link that video down below, and I really enjoyed doing it. I don't love Hard Times as much as I love North and South, and it's not one of my favourite Dickens books. It's probably in the lower half of my estimation. It's one of Dickens's books that I find more interesting than I find enjoyable. I don't think it has as good a plot as many of the rest of his books, but I do think that the themes it explores of education and of industrialisation, and particularly of how industrialisation might affect the way people think, is really interesting. It's quite hard to explain what Hard Times is about. One of the reasons why I don't love it as much as other Dickens novels is because every single character kind of feels like a minor character and every plot feels like a subplot. It doesn't really feel like it has a main focal point that you can kind of grasp onto, but basically it focuses on this town of Coketown, this new industrialised town. There's a man called Mr. Gradgrind who is MP for Coketown, and he also helps run a school. He brings up his own children and the children of the school to care only for science, for fact, for logic, for rationality, and to have no interest in imagination or stories or play. I find it a really fascinating novel, and it's probably, although Dickens has social criticism in all of his novels, this is probably the one where he kind of sets out like a very clear manifesto. It is in a way the most like philosophical of his novels, and his ideas are really fascinating. However, I don't feel the plot is quite as well executed as in some of his other books. But next I read Framley Parsonage by Anthony Trollope. This is the 4th book in the Barsetshire Chronicles, which I have been buddy reading with Caroline from BBC Girl 520, and I'll link her down below. I absolutely love the Barsetshire Chronicles, and one of the things I really like about them is that although it's a series, it's kind of more like a series of interconnected novels than it is a set series. So although they share a lot of the same minor characters, they don't share the same major characters, and they're just sort of set roughly in the same area, and a lot of people like crop up from other books, which I really love. I really love Framley Parsonage a lot. I think it's probably my second favourite of the series so far. I think Barchester Towers still beats it slightly for me. The book follows a character called Mark Roberts, who is the vicar of a place called Framley, and Mark has been good friends for a long time with the local squire, Lord Lufton, and also has to an extent, good relationship with Lord Lufton's mother, Lady Lufton. And Mark is a young man, although he is a clergyman, that doesn't necessarily mean that he is automatically more moral and more amiable than all the rest of the men around him. He makes friends with some people that he possibly shouldn't make friends with, gets caught up in some of his friends' like debt problems, and everything kind of spirals from there in a really interesting way. The book also deals with Mark's sister, Lucy Robert, who comes to live with him, and her relationship with Lord Lufton. I think Anthony Trollope's writing is so good. I love his writing so much. Dickens is my favourite author, obviously, and one of the things I love about Dickens is how like insane some of his writing is. How sometimes it just feel like he's just like exploded all the words onto the page, and sometimes they're quite messy and disorderly. I kind of love that. It's something I really enjoy about Dickens, and one of the things I enjoy about Trollope, in contrast to Dickens, I suppose, is that Trollope's writing feels very calm and organised. It doesn't feel like overly crafted. It just feels like he was like writing very calmly and very slowly, and just like getting out everything he needed to say in a nice, neat, ordered manner, which is sometimes quite enjoyable to read. I thought the characterisation was brilliant, and the themes the book explores, especially to do with like the role of clergymen within Victorian society, was really good. Simultaneously, he is criticising Victorian society for the fact that they assume clergymen are not human and are like magically more moral than everybody else, and that they should be held to a much higher standard than everybody else, that they assume that they have no flaws. But it also criticises Victorian society for immoral acts that they think are kind of okay to do, but actually they would consider immoral if a clergyman did them. So it's very interesting in that sense. I think the thing I really liked about Framley Parsonage is that it had all the like church politics and interesting, unusual plot that Barchester Towers has, but it also had like the nice love story element of Dr. Thorne. Then it has quite a similar love story present in it to Dr. Thorne, and I think what I really loved about it is just that it's really different. Like, I read lots of Victorian literature, and a lot of Victorian literature features a 19-year-old female heroine, and you know, like, I love North and South and Our Mutual Friend, and I love their 19-year-old female heroines. I have no problem with them, but sometimes it's really nice to read a Victorian novel where the main hero is a like 27-year-old married clergyman who has 2 young children, because you don't get that very much in Victorian literature, and that's just really nice. It's very refreshing, and that's something I love about Anthony Trollope's work, how unique and interesting he is. It made me realise, reading Framley Parsonage, that I would like to read everything by Anthony Trollope, which is quite a tall order. It's more ambitious than trying to read everything by Charles Dickens or Hardy or Gaskell or Jane Austen, which I've done because they all wrote like between 6 and 14 books, and that's kind of doable. Anthony Trollope wrote 46. However, I realise that if I read an Anthony Trollope book every other month for the next 7 years, I will, at the end of that 7 years, have read everything by Anthony Trollope. So yes, that's my current plan. A slightly less enjoyable Victorian book I read this month was Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, which I also buddy read with Caroline from BBC Girl as part of the Booktube Buddyathon. This is set in the 18th century, though it was written in the 19th century. It's about a boy called Jim Hawkins, and his parents own an inn, and to this inn there comes a man who used to be a pirate, who used to be a buccaneer, as they mostly call it in the book. And due to various events to do with this pirate that comes to their inn, Jim Hawkins ends up being the cabin boy on a ship with the local squire and the doctor and various crew members going to this island to find some treasure. So I thought the characterisation was good, especially of Long John Silver. I thought he was a very interesting character, and the plot was quite interesting and fun. But the writing was kind of boring, and for the most part I just found the book quite dull. I feel like it's one of those books where if I saw a film adaptation I'd probably really enjoy it, but as a book I just found it a little bit dull, and I didn't find the way like the action was described very exciting at all. It did really put me in the mood for Pirates of the Caribbean, and I was like extra excited to go and see the 5th Pirates of the Caribbean when it came out, but apart from that, like, I didn't get that much out of Treasure Island. Another Victorian book I read in the month of May, doing quite well on my classics this month, was Elizabeth Gaskell's The Moorland Cottage. I have read all of Elizabeth Gaskell's full-length novels, but I haven't read all of her novellas, and I think actually I would quite like to read all of her novellas before I do an Elizabeth Gaskell week, which hopefully will be in September. I really enjoyed this. It was really emotionally charged and really good, and even though it was very short, it had like a lot of weight in it and was really interesting. So it's about a character called Maggie who lives in a cottage on the moors with her brother and her mother. Her father died a long time ago. Her brother is a really interesting character. He's not a nice person, and he takes advantage of Maggie's affection for him and is quite cruel to her and quite manipulative. There's also a big house nearby where a fairly wealthy man lives, and his son becomes interested in Maggie, and there is that really nice, really well-developed love story in this that was a really nice aspect of the book, because most of the dramatic tension comes from Maggie's relationship with her brother, not from her relationship with Frank, and I thought that was really nicely done. Like, all of Gaskell's work, it's really well written, and her characterisation is really well observed, and she's so good, I think, at capturing human relationships and the way that different people behave. Another really interesting thing about the Moorland Cottage is that apparently it was the model for, or the inspiration for, George Eliot's Mill on the Floss. Now, I haven't read George Eliot's Mill on the Floss, but I have seen a film, and assuming that film adaptation that I've seen was fairly accurate to the actual book, The Mill on the Floss, there are a lot of similarities, like a lot of similarities. Like, I feel like Elizabeth Gaskell would have the right to be quite annoyed about how many similarities there are. It made me more interested to read Mill on the Floss, to be honest, although I don't think I'll like it as much as this, because I like Elizabeth Gaskell much more than George Eliot. But then I read an Edwardian classic this month, which is Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. I really loved reading from this edition because it's really beautiful. Like, they have a lot of beautiful illustrations and kind of fun, like, interactive elements that are really nice. So I think it kind of added a lot to the experience to read it in this edition, and I really enjoy all of the illustration in that sense. It's a beautifully produced edition. I feel like most people do know roughly at least the story of Peter Pan. It is about a place called Neverland and a boy called Peter Pan who never grows up, and what happens when he takes 3 children, the darling siblings, off to live with him in Neverland, and everything goes on from there. There's also lots of like actions with pirates. I really enjoyed Peter Pan. I thought the writing was so witty and so enjoyable and so lovely. Like, it's written really wonderfully, especially I think because it was a play first. You might kind of expect the dialogue to be really good and the prose not to be as great, but actually, like, the prose and the way things are written and J.M. Barrie's turn of phrase is wonderful, and I really adored the writing in this book. It's so nice. There are a lot of problematic elements in this book. There are a lot of very problematic things to do with the presentation of race, to do with the presentation of gender. It's very much of its time, and it's also very much worse than a lot of other books of its time were. I think partly because it is a children's book, and I think they do tend to have more like exaggerated stereotypes in. I think it's worth being aware of these things when you read Peter Pan, but at the same time I did enjoy the writing a lot, and yeah, it was interesting to finally read this after having vaguely known the story for so many years. Next, you move on to some modern classics. This month I read A Start in Life by Anita Bruckner, which was possibly my favourite book of the month, maybe joint with another one that I'll talk about later. This is one of the Penguin's Essential editions, and they very kindly sent me a few of these editions for review. I'm really glad as well that they sent me this for review, because I don't think I would have read this otherwise. Or when Penguin sent me like a list of the Penguin Essentials books and I had like a look about what various ones of them were about, I thought this sounded really interesting. And it was so good. I'm just going to read you the first line, because I read the first line and was like, oh yes, I'm going to like this. Dr. Weiss, at 40, knew that her life had been ruined by literature. So this book is about a character called Ruth Weiss, and the book basically explores how her problematic and complicated family situation and her interest in literature has affected her life and how she grew up. This book was first published in 1981, and the bulk of the book takes place, I guess, between like the 50s and the 70s. The book basically follows Ruth's life and her relationship with her family and friends. She has quite an odd family in that her parents don't really behave like they're adults. After the death of Ruth's grandmother, her parents kind of regress. They spend most of their time just sitting in bed. Her mother used to be an actress, but now she just sits in bed all the time smoking and talking to their housekeeper, and her father is having affairs with women that are motivated much more by like a desire for comfort and to be cooked for than any lust. And it's just a very, very interesting family setup, and Ruth is a very interesting character who I really felt for and really sympathised with and found really interesting. I loved the writing in this book so much, and I'm definitely hoping to pick up some more by Anita Bruckner in the future, because this was beautiful writing. It was beautiful and elegant, but also like simple and just stating things and not being like overly flowery or overly complicated. But I think my only criticism of it would be that the ending was quite abrupt, and like I loved this book so much and I loved her as a character so much. I could have read a book that was like 4 times the length very, very happily, but regardless, I really, really enjoyed this, and I think this will definitely be one of my favourite books of the year. Then I also read Any Human Heart by William Boyd. This was first published in 2002, so the observant amongst you may notice that this is not the edition I held up in my Booktube Buddyathon TBR video earlier this month. This is the new Penguin Essentials edition, which they also kindly sent me for a review, which was good, because I realised when I opened the copy that I had to start reading it that it was not mine. A copy of Any Human Heart that I had thought was mine and had been on my shelf for 8 years actually belonged to my mum and was a Christmas present from her boss 8 years ago. So I'm now going to return that to my mum and keep this copy, which is actually mine. No one should ever lend me their books. They will never get them back. Anyway, Any Human Heart. I could not remember the last time I have had such conflicting feelings on a book. So Any Human Heart follows the character of Logan Mountstuart, and basically the book follows his life from his teenage years up until his old age, from the 1920s to the 1970s. It spans a really long period of time, and the way the book is kind of structured is through diary entries. So the idea is, quite an interesting, fun conceit, is that Logan Mountstuart was an author during his life, so these diary entries are being published after his death. They've been compiled by an editor who is now publishing these and releasing them into the world. So like it has an index in the back of the book, and there are like little footnote comments from the editor and stuff like that, which I really, really enjoyed. I thought that was quite fun. The book basically looks at Logan's life over this long period of time, the relationships he has with women, the relationships he has with his friends and family, the relationship that he has with his work as a writer and then later as a spy and an art critic. Like, he does a lot of things in his life. The book is really international as well, which I really enjoyed. Logan was born in South America but grows up in Britain. In his youth he lives in Paris and London. Later he lives in New York. He also lives in various other places in France. He also lives for a while in Nigeria, and I really liked that it spanned such a long period of time, that it spanned so many interesting historical events and political and social changes, and that it spanned so many countries. I found that really, really interesting. So there were some things I loved about this book, and some things I hated so much. It simultaneously reminded me of 2 different works of literature. It reminded me greatly of Anthony Powell's A Dance to the Music of Time. A Dance to the Music of Time is one of my absolute favourite works of literature ever written. It's a series of 12 books set between the 1920s and the 1970s, just as Any Human Heart is, and it follows the life of a man called Nick and all of the different people he meets over his life in this very long period of the 20th century. And in many ways, Any Human Heart reminded me of it, and that made me really happy. And Any Human Heart also reminded me massively of a book called All That Is by James Salter, which is my least favourite book of all time, mostly because it's incredibly misogynistic and boring. Logan's attitude toward women and the presentation of women in this book is just atrocious. Logan sexualises every single woman in this book except for his mother. And it got really boring. Like, it became really, really repetitive in the way that he keeps on just finding women, and he cheats on everyone, and he also sleeps with a lot of women who are married, and it's not necessarily that that's not believable, but I feel like he would have some scruples. Sometimes I feel like he would feel guilty, but he never feels any guilt. And there's this whole of this book, there's like all of these many, many years of his life, and I just wanted him at some point to realise that he was a horrible person, because I really hated this man a lot. There's also a lot of bits in this book that just stink of male wish fulfillment in a really horrible, unpleasant way. Like, there's a bit where Logan just like hires 2 prostitutes so he can have a threesome, and like that bit serves no purpose whatsoever in this book. It has no right being here. Like, it served no purpose. The way this book writes about sex, and also the presentation of women in general, is just really, I just hated it. I hated it so much. None of the women in this book feel like real characters. They're not fleshed out at all. At the same time, because it's kind of diary entry form, Logan is kind of the only character that feels real. Like his male friends don't really feel like real people either, so I can kind of cut in a bit of slack for that. At the same time, the way he treats women and the presentation of women and the constant sexualization of all of the female characters in this book, I found exhausting and repetitive and bad writing as well as being misogynistic. And it's so complicated because I hated that about this book, and there were points in this book where I detested Logan and I was really furious with William Boyd for the way he writes about women and the way he writes about Logan's attitudes towards sex. But at the same time, there are elements of this book that I loved. There are some beautiful, beautiful passages. There are bits that make me cry. There are wonderful historical interest. There is a fascinating exploration of change over time. And I felt so divided on this book because there were so many things that I loved and that I could have loved more, and yet Logan's relationships with women just infuriated me. So I don't know how I feel about this book. So yes, mixed feelings on this one. But anyway, at the beginning of this month, I finished listening to the audiobook of The Cuckoo's Calling. Cuckoo's Calling by Robert Galbraith, aka J.K. Rowling, is a mystery novel. There is a man called Cormoran Strike and his kind of temporary secretary, Robin, who are looking into this particular mystery. 3 months before the book is set, a woman called Lula Landry, a young woman who was a very famous model, was found to have fallen off her balcony. At the time, it was considered suicide, but Cormoran Strike, the main character, gets asked by Lula's adopted brother if he will look into the case, because Lula's adopted brother thinks that it was not suicide and that it was in fact a murder. I have slightly mixed feelings about The Cuckoo's Calling, basically because I loved listening to it. I really loved the experience of reading this book. I found it really enjoyable. I found the characters really interesting. I thought the mystery was fascinating, the writing, the setup, the way that it explored London, and the fact that it explored a very complicated and diverse London, that there's a really broad stretch of society caught up in this mystery in The Cuckoo's Calling, I love. But I also liked the dynamic between Strike and Robin, and I hope it continues to be similar in future books, because I feel like it could go ways that would annoy me, but I liked it very much in this book. Basically, I was really, really loving this book, and I loved it very, very much. And then the ending, the conclusion of the mystery let it down a little bit for me. It kind of wasn't a problem, because I still really, really enjoyed the book. I just think I would have loved it more if there had been an ending that had been slightly different. Some aspects of the solution, some aspects of the revelations at the end of the book were very, very clever and very smart and very interestingly done. There was one thing that I didn't believe, that I couldn't credit, and that kind of makes the book fall apart a little bit. Not completely, I still really, really enjoyed it. I will definitely read on with the series because I really enjoy the dynamics and the writing, but I didn't quite credit the final resolution of the mystery, and that was a slight shame. But anyway. I also read a YA book this month, which is quite unusual for me, and that was The Smell of Other People's Houses by Bonnie Sue Hitchcock. And this was absolutely incredible. This is probably the best YA book that I've ever read, and I really, really enjoyed it. I didn't realise it was YA until I started reading it, but I'm kind of glad actually that I didn't know it was YA, because I feel like if I'd have known it was YA, I probably wouldn't have bought it, and this was so good. It was great. It looks at 4 teenagers who are growing up in Alaska in 1970, and they're all about sort of 16, 17, and it's simultaneously about how they deal with problems that many, many teenagers has. It looks a lot at problems of family and relationships, teen pregnancy, problems of sort of where people belong. It deals a lot with very problematic family situations and complicated relationships in a wonderful way that is very, very brilliant and very complicated in this book, but also is quite common in a lot of YA. But it also has this really fascinating element of looking at Alaska at that time. When all these teenagers were born, Alaska was not part of the United States. It was not a state of America, but now it is, and the book is very interesting in looking at how that has changed their lives and how that has affected their culture. Many of these teenagers come from native backgrounds and had childhoods that were very, very different to their lives have now become, and I thought the way that the book looks at that and the way that it also looks at hunting and fishing and how that affects the culture of the time is just brilliant and so interesting and so unique, because I don't know that much about Alaskan history, and this was great. It was also incredibly moving. I read this in a day, which was really, really nice, and it made me cry quite a few times. It was really, really well done, really tenderly and nicely put. Like I do find often with YA, there were a few things that were a little bit overstated for me, but for the most part I really enjoyed this. I thought it was really, really strong and interesting book. So yeah, I would definitely recommend this. I really, really enjoyed it. I also think the cover is beautiful. Isn't it beautiful? Anyway. And then finally, my other favourite book of the month alongside Anita Bruckner's Start in Life was Kazuo Ishiguro's When We Were Orphans. I can't believe it's been so long since I read Kazuo Ishiguro. I love him very much. I'm sorry that I neglected you. If you had asked me when I was like 19 who my favourite contemporary author was, I definitely would have said Kazuo Ishiguro. I've read Never Let Me Go and The Remains of the Day 2 or 3 times. I've also read Nocturnes by him that I really enjoyed. And then 2 years ago, The Buried Giant came out and I read it and I didn't like it and it put me off a lot. But I've been meaning to read this for a long time. And then one of you guys commented in my video where I did like my long-term TBR and all the unread books I had on my shelf and mentioned that I should read this and that it was really good. So I thought, yes, the time has come, I will read this. I loved it so much. It was so good. It was great. It was brilliant. Oh, it was so good. So this book is set in London and Shanghai in the 1920s and 30s. It's about a young man called Christopher. He grew up in Shanghai, but then when he was about 10, both of his parents mysteriously disappeared and he was sent to live with his aunt in England where he grew up there. Later on in the 1930s, he has become this great detective. He models himself a bit on Sherlock Holmes and he solves many, many cases in London, but he's always kind of thinking about the disappearance of his parents when he was a child, and he ends up going to Shanghai in the book to try and sort of solve this case and find out precisely what happened with them. It is wonderful. It is so good. There are so many things I love about this book. Like, the way that he explores memory in this book is wonderful, and it's quite similar to the way he explores it in The Remains of the Day and Never Let Me Go, but it's something I love in his writing, and I think the reason why I didn't like The Buried Giant is because it's mostly in the third person, and I think, for me, Kazuo Ishiguro does first person better, especially when he's dealing with memory, because he does this thing where you know that a character is telling something in retrospect and they mention small details and then they're like, oh no, maybe it wasn't then that I heard that thing. Maybe actually that person said it at another point and then skips to another scene that is connected so that you never quite know what's real. And it feels so believable and so like memory is, and it's also just really, really powerful. There's so many other things I love in this book as well. I love that it was set in 1930s Shanghai. It's a period in history that I don't know that much about, but one that absolutely fascinated me in this book. I'm definitely going to be recommending Nick to read this because he lived in Shanghai for a few months and he also studied like a lot of Chinese history at university and quite a lot of 20th century Chinese history, so I know that he will be fascinated to read this and will love it a lot. This was so well written as well and so interesting. I loved that alongside the main story there's also a lot of sort of sub-stories that deal with really interesting relationships. The character of Sarah Hemmings was really, really wonderful. I also really enjoyed Christopher's relationship with his adopted daughter. I thought that was a lovely and interesting and different twist to it. There was so much in this book that I loved. I don't think the ending was completely perfect, but I kind of forgave it because it's such a good book. I've been trying to work out where it like stands in my Ishiguro rating, and I think I prefer this to Never Let Me Go. I think this is a better book for me. I don't think I quite prefer it to The Remains of the Day. What I think is that this is a more interesting idea than The Remains of the Day, but it's not quite as well executed as The Remains of the Day, whereas I feel like The Remains of the Day is just perfect. It has quite a lot of similarities though in the kind of tone and the exploration of memory, which is something I really enjoyed, and I just loved this. I thought it was so good. I would highly, highly recommend it. I think it's very underrated and I thought it was wonderful. And yes, another one I'm certain will end up in my favourite books of 2017 at the end of the year. So yes, those are all the books that I had to talk about today. I'm sorry if this has been very, very long. It's a problem, especially when I read a lot of 19th century literature in a month, because I end up rambling a lot about them as always. But anyway, thank you for watching. Please let me know if you have read any of these books down in the comments and what you thought of them. I would be interested to know. There will be a video on Thursday, but then there probably won't be very many videos in the next 2 weeks because I'm actually going on holiday very soon. I'm going to Hong Kong and Thailand, which I'm excited about. So because of that, for the rest of June, videos will probably be kind of few and far between, but I'm sure you will bear with me, and I'll be back in July with many more videos. Thank you very much for watching and happy reading.